I was at this juxtaposition of writing about personal finance and thinking about financial independence. But then in my other part of my life, I was taking care of people who had just been told that they have 6 months to live. And so I started thinking, I wonder what these people who now have to confront death in a very real way, what can they tell me about spending and money and finances?
This is 10,000 Heroes, and I'm Ankur Shah. We are surrounded by options, examples, potential futures walking around us, what we each can be, or what we might seek to desperately avoid. 10,000 Heroes is here to provide inspiration, intimacy, and maybe even a little bit of guidance as to what it means to live a truly purposeful life, and how we can each get there in our own individual way. Our guest today is author and speaker Jordan Grummet. He's worn many hats in his life, which we'll get into. But what I want to highlight most is Jordan's commitment and flexibility with his journey. He's not letting the illusion of achievement get in the way of continued exploration of his purpose. But before I spoil you with the details, let's jump in.
So you started your book, which ostensibly is a book about money and finances, with an anecdote about how your father died when you were really young. And I want to start with that because it was incredibly powerful and memorable. And it just was the first of a string of pretty major transformations that have unfolded through your life. But if you're willing to talk about it, I'd love to hear a little bit of how that incident affected you and kind of guided you towards the next step in your life.
So no one expects, right, at 7 years old that their father is going to die. Obviously, it was shocking, right? I was 7 years old. I only knew the life I knew. And certainly, I don't know if I was old enough or emotionally mature enough to really know what that meant. You know, he was there one moment, he had a brain aneurysm and then was gone the next. The most interesting thing about that for me was really my response to it. I idolized my father as a kid. I wanted to be exactly like him. So when he died, it made concrete in me this idea that I would become a physician like he was. He was a prominent oncologist or cancer doctor. And it really set the pace for how I would identify kind of my purpose in life. It was to become this doctor like he was, which wasn't a given because at that age, I also had a learning disability. And it was, you know, you never know, are you going to make it through college and medical school, et cetera. But it really set the pace for how I would identify myself and what would become my purpose for a lot of my young life.
Okay. So you use this magic word for me, which is purpose. And it's a hot button word for a lot of people I talk to. They're just firmly in this kind of rational mentality of they hate that word. And then there's all these people I talk to that are on this more mystical thing. That's all they want to talk about. But let's say, well, when you were 7 years old, you had a sense of purpose for the first time. Is that?
Certainly. Seeing my father die, and I was trying to make sense of this thing that just made no sense. What became purposeful for me was to take his place and to kind of fill his shoes.
Okay. And that worked for?
Oh, I think it worked up until I started practicing medicine. And there was a time, especially after I'd finished all my training, where I started realizing that that kind of identity and purpose that I had put on myself after my father's death didn't sit as well as I thought it had. I didn't feel comfortable being a physician in a lot of ways. One is I didn't have a lot of physician friends. I didn't hang out in the physician's lounge in the hospital. I would go to parties where I knew no one, and I would almost be ashamed or anxious about people asking me what I did for a living.
God, that's hilarious. I mean, so I'm Indian American. So I don't know if you know about Indian Americans in the States, but like we're told all the time that you have to be a doctor or an engineer. And I had all this angst in my 20s and 30s because I'd go to those parties, maybe the same parties you did, maybe not. And I wasn't a doctor and I couldn't say that. So it's crazy to me that brought, what brought you angst about that?
I think the disconnect was that this identity that I was wearing like a cloak over myself didn't really reflect my insides really well. It reflected this childhood notion of who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to do. it's easy to do that when you're young and you don't really know what being a doctor is. When I actually became this thing that I only had a notion of, I realized that while I liked it, and I would never go back and say I wouldn't have done it again, there were other things that felt much more meaningful to me. And I was hiding them away in little corners of time when I could figure out how to fit it in. So, for instance, writing or public speaking, or I was really, in essence, a communicator. And so I could use those skills as a doctor, but I would find ways to spend a little bit of time here and there doing these things that were really more my passions. But I told myself, well, you can never make a living doing that. That's not what you do. You're a doctor, right? Those are kind of hobbies, is what I told myself.
Yeah. Okay. This is great. So you had this like round one of purpose where you're like, I'm going to take this mantle of being a doctor to kind of live in the legacy of my father and really align with that path. And that worked for a while. And then you got more information about your life through living and about who you are. And then, I don't know, 20 years later, you kind of went through this process again and came up with a different conclusion of what you thought your purpose would be.
Very much so. And that process of deciding my purpose was something different was not a today, tomorrow type thing. It was months and years of really contemplating who I am and what has import to me. And I had to actually figure out the financial part to give myself permission, I think, to go after what I thought my real purpose was, because I wasn't sure I could really make a living at it.
Okay. So yeah, like how did you, let's go into that. How did you do that? And then I'm curious how you did the actual kind of analytical part of determining your purpose. But how did you get the financial permission?
So the financial part was easier than you would think. I grew up with really good financial modeling. So my mom and my stepdad were business people. They were side hustlers. They owned real estate. They saved a lot more than they spent. They invested in the stock market. So I followed their modeling and did all the same things myself. And I built a business where I made a lot of money. So I was doing all the right financial moves, but I had no idea the vocabulary or reasoning behind what I was doing. I was just doing the right things because they did. In 2014, this guy, Jim Daly, sent me his book to review for my medical blog. And when I read it, he actually gave me that vocabulary of what financial independence looks like, what enough, quote unquote, enough money looks like. And I was able to do some calculations and realize that I have enough money. So I had already set up the systems. I had owned some real estate myself because I was being like my parents. I had invested heavily in the stock market. I had my own burgeoning medical practice that I was making money off of, as well as I was doing a bunch of side hustles. One of them was to consult with a hospice company and be one of their medical directors, which eventually became a lot bigger part of my purpose as time went on. So the actual financial part, I came from a place of privilege and education and knowledge. So I was pretty lucky. It was just a matter of taking what I had already and understanding some of the financial dynamics and how they work to realize that indeed, I actually have enough money. I can work a lot less. And so that was that big permission process. Is I said, okay, I understand math and I can look at the numbers and understand the math, and with compound interests and years to go and retirement accounts, and say, okay, there's enough money there that you don't need to be working this hard. The financial permission was the easy part. The emotional permission was the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But for the financial side, you got a clear definition of what enough meant. And then you're like, oh, I've already got that if I continue making good financial decisions.
Yeah. So at that point, I kind of dived into the financial independence community, and there are lots of ways of calculating and definitions of what financial independence means. But one of the most simple ways is to just take your yearly spending and multiply it by 25. And if you have that much invested at today's dollars, that should at least provide you for the next 30 years. So if you live off of $40,000 a year, 25 times 40 is $1 million. You need to have $1 million invested. And so I was able to use those type of calculations and say, aha, yeah, I'm financially where I need to be.
Yeah. Okay. And then you mentioned that the emotional part was much harder than that. What was that? Was that the connection to the identity of being a doctor or being like your father, or what was in that for you?
It was all of it. And a big part of the problem. So yes, for sure. Those small wisps of connection to my father that were growing more tenuous over the years, it was still that connection I had from a man who I could barely remember, right? He died when I was 7 and I'm now in my 40s. Yes, also the holding on to being a big earner and being a doctor and having some place in society, even if it didn't fit comfortably, it was still some status that I had, both economically as well as in job title. But what I really struggled with is I had spent so much time building up both this physician identity and eventually this financial identity, and none of them really felt like they were truly who I was. And so the hard part emotionally was to say, okay, this big thing, this goal that you eventually built up, which is having enough money to leave medicine, this thing that you thought was so important, you're there now. Well, what's important now? Who am I? If I'm not going to identify anymore as a physician, if that's not who I am, if that's not my purpose in life, what is my purpose? Who am I? What should I be doing with my life? And that can be really disconcerting, especially to someone who had such an intense form of purpose and identity growing up in this kind of I'm going to be a physician world. That actually made me really anxious and depressed for a long time.
Wow. And as you went through this process, I'm a coach. I guide people through similar processes. There's like Tony Robbins. There's all kinds of products that are available. Did you use any of that, or was this totally organic? You're just like on your own wrestling with these questions at night, or did you like go to some website and be like, these are the 6 ways to help you find your purpose?
No, I went at it organically. So in hard times in my life, I typically write. So I'd been doing a medical blog before I started writing a financial blog. And actually, for some of those tough years, I wrote a new blog post, which I published every day for a year or two, where I just hashed out all of my ideas and what I was going through and what I thought had import and what didn't. It became almost an online diary, but also a form of online accountability. So I had to put down what I was thinking, and then I had to say, okay, you had the courage to write it. Do you have the courage to do it? The amazing thing about that is by going back to writing and becoming part of the financial community, I was actually searching for all that purpose that I knew was underneath there, but that I had been ignoring all those years. The public speaking, the writing, eventually I started a podcast. All of these things helped me become that communicator, that thing that had purpose for me that I had been ignoring for all those years. It also provided me a community. So I became part of the financial independence community. And I remember being right at the end of my medical practice where I'm like, I've got to get out of this. And I went to a financial conference. It was actually something called Camp FI, or Camp Financial Independence. In this case, 50 or 60 people get together, and it's like it's a retreat where you get together and you talk about financial issues, but you really talk about life. And going to that conference, this was in 2008, surrounded me by people who just supported me. And they were like, yes, you can leave medicine. Yes, medicine doesn't have to be your identity. Yes, this is no longer serving you and you've done the financial work. Now you can start embracing things that feel more comfortable. And it was after that I really developed that courage to start walking away from medicine. Now, I didn't walk away from medicine completely. Instead, I just started subtracting out the parts of medicine I didn't like. So as opposed to throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I just kept getting rid of things I didn't like. I didn't like having a clinic, got rid of it. I didn't like working in nursing homes, got rid of that. What I was left with was part-time consultant hospice work, which I would do if no one was paying me for. So I knew that was part of that physician identity that still fit my meaning and purpose. But I got rid of a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. So, but it's a little, given what I read of the book, and we should probably talk about the book at some point, but there's some of controversial is the right word, but the advice that you're giving or the viewpoint you're representing is not the typical make a lot of money and retire early advice. So that you were writing this finance blog, you were wrestling with these issues. How was that received in that community? Or did those ideas come later?
So a lot of those ideas came later. I was at this juxtaposition of writing about personal finance and thinking about financial independence. But then in my other part of my life, I was taking care of people who had just been told that they have 6 months to live. And so I started thinking, I wonder what these people who now have to confront death in a very real way, what can they tell me about spending and money and finances? What do these people regret? What is on their mind when you're taking to that moment where you can't put it off any longer? All of a sudden, we always know this idea that life is finite, but we don't really have to face it. And I'm dealing every day with people who have to face how finite life is. What do you want to do in the next 6 months? What has import to you and what do you regret? And funny enough, almost no one said, I regret that I didn't work nights and weekends. No one said, I regret that I only had a net worth of $500,000 and not $1 million. The things they regretted had very little to do with money. On the other hand, from my financial life, money is important. It provides a framework for us to be able to pursue things we really want to do. So it was trying to take these two different realities and put them together that eventually developed the narrative that you read in the book, is that as opposed to saying we all should work really hard, make a lot of money and be rich, I started thinking about the idea that maybe we should start with purpose and identity. And after we come to some conclusions about that, or at least have a direction to go in, then we should start thinking about our financial framework and find a way for that to work within who we want to be as a person. And that was the exact opposite of a lot of what traditional finance was saying. Traditional finance was saying, make lots of money, do those side hustles and invest, but wasn't spending a lot of time in talking about what those things serve and maybe how we can start living some of those things that this money is supposed to serve, even before we're at that financial independence point.
Yeah. So the traditional financial advice is coming from a perspective of we want to experience freedom. We want to be able to live in an unconstrained way and not have to feel the pressure of listening to somebody else's rules. So we're going to maximize as much money as we can now. This is kind of like Mr. Money mustache style in a way, and like cut our expenses to the minimum. I think he's like more holistic than this though. Not trying to throw you under the bus, Mr. Money mustache. And by doing that, we can retire soon and then get to live the life of our dreams. And you're going in the hospice world and you're like, oh, these like these people's experience of knowing that death is imminent is directly counter to that kind of advice.
Yeah, it is. And, it helped me really come to terms with this idea that the problem with typical personal finance is we tend to look at money as the goal, whereas these hospice people were saying, let's change that around and look at money as a tool that we then use as a resource to do other more important things. Because hospice people spend a lot of time thinking about what was important in my life. And if I'm lucky enough to accomplish anything more in the next 6 months, what do I want to accomplish? So it was really that transition from goal to tool. And I think kind of dealing with the dying helped me see that really clearly.
Yeah. I mean, I love what I perceive as the integration of that viewpoint, because there's a lot of people, and this is the culture I came from as a anti-capitalist activist for years, of just hating money and seeing money as the devil and like taking a voluntary vow of poverty, not wanting anything to do with it. And it becomes like extremely limiting, as you can imagine. And there's lots of opportunities you don't have and ways that you want to help people that you can't. And, the musicians you want to see that you can't go to. And so the flip side of that is just like money is everything. And we, most people, especially people listening to this show, they will associate that with emptiness and they're not like totally going down that path. But you're offering a sort of like integrated vision.
Yeah. And I've known in hospice, I've seen plenty of really poor people just barely getting by who've died happy because they had intense love and passion in their lives. And then I've seen people die in hospice with all the money you could ever imagine and die miserable. I think we have to stop seeing it as black and white. It's not one way or another. Money is not the devil, and yet it's not everything. It's a useful tool in order to accomplish some of the things we want to accomplish. Could we accomplish a lot of these things without money? Looking at the world, you'd say that yes, in some ways we could. Yeah, we'd like to have a certain amount of money, but then having enough money and being safe and deferring gratification a little bit can also be really helpful later on. It can make your life easier when you start pursuing those things you want to pursue. Just having the money to jump on a plane to see a band or to meet an artist or to experience a hike that has meaning to you. Without any money, you can't do those things, right? You can find another path. You can meet a different artist. You can find substitutions. So it's not the end all and be all, but it certainly can be a nice tool when you have it in your back pocket.
Yeah. So I do have a little bit of a beef with taking the recommendations from people who have a terminal illness and applying them to our own lives. But before I get into that, I think there's also incredible value there. So I just love to, if you'd be willing to share a few more of their, like the recommendations you've gleaned from that population. Sure, they didn't want to focus on money, but like, what did they want to focus on, or what would their recommendations be for themselves or for us?
The question really is, when you're on your deathbed, what will you regret not having the courage to say, do, or which people you haven't connected with? So it's the story not of success, right? I had a patient who in his 20s climbed Mount Everest and was looking back as he was dying in his 40s, looking back at how he was so happy he took the time out of his professional life to do this. He never made it to the top. He failed. But it wasn't whether he succeeded or failed. It was the fact that he had the courage to do something that was meaningful to him. And at one point, he said, what if I had put it off till later? What if I had put it off till it was more convenient? And so we have these things that are important to us. For some of us, it's relationships. I had a patient who was dying of leukemia in her 50s, and she had had a bad divorce when she was really young. She hadn't had kids yet. She had just had a miscarriage. She walked in on her husband cheating on her, and they almost never talked again. They got divorced, and that was it. And as she was dying in her 50s, she had real regret, not that she got divorced, but that she had never reconciled this once important relationship in her life, nor acknowledged the fact that maybe her ex-husband had had a lot of pain, and that the cheating and all that was a sign that he was going through some things too. And so I remember her calling her ex-husband after not talking for decades, and resolving some of those issues and forgiving him and asking for forgiveness. Those are the kind of things, like, no one can answer for you what's going to be important to you at the end of life. But often we have things that we wish we had the courage to try that we didn't, or relationships that were broken, which we always wish we had tried to fix. And so it's a very individual thing. I just think, again, it's really powerful to start thinking about these things way before you're close to your deathbed. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. And maybe that helps highlight the kind of the caveat that I'd like to place there, or, what we can discuss. So if someone tells me, imagine you're going to die in a year, how would you spend that time? I think I would necessarily spend that next year in a way that's not how I would spend it otherwise. Because right now I'm trying to save money. I'm trying to support my family. I'm trying to build this business, I'm trying to do all these things. If I just had a year to live, I would take the money that I've already saved and just hang out with my family and probably just spend all the time I could with them and with my friends, and just play a lot of Frisbee and listen to a lot of reggae music and just do the things I like doing. But to me, it doesn't make sense to just do that right now, because I'm not going to die. And I do have this other future that I'm preparing for. So that's why I think there's this a bit of a gap. But when you bring up examples of well, who would you like to apologize to? Or who would you like to, get into those conversations of connection and forgiveness with? There's no opportunity cost for me doing that right now. In the way that I'm going to spend 3 months in Antarctica with my daughter. There's a reason I'm not doing that right now, because I'm building towards something else. But there's no good reason for me not to forgive my father, or whatever the example is.
And what I really like about the examples you gave is, so it's true, we don't have to throw out all of our life. We don't have to throw out all of deferred gratification to do exactly what we want right now. The idea behind that exercise is to start getting intentional about what are those things that are important to me, so that you can build them into your life now. Or at least if you decide to totally defer gratification, if you're you know what, I feel in my heart, I'm going to live to 90. I'm 30 now. I want to work my butt off because I want to make a lot of money. I'm going to let it compound, and that's going to last me for the rest of my life. That's okay. But at least then you are intentional about what you're doing that for. At least you're starting to build this idea of what is purpose and meaning to me? How do I identify as a person? It is fine to decide that deferred gratification is good for you, but at least then you know what you're doing it in service for. And that's why I think there are a lot of different ways to get towards a financially independent place. Some of them really ask you to defer gratification quite a bit. Others are the exact opposite and say, go for a passion play where you're not deferring gratification at all. Each one of those may be right for you or not right for you, depending at the time of your life. But what I like about that exercise is it causes you to get very intentional about what's important so that you can build a life to match what you want it to match, regardless of which tact you decide to take to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. And given the process you went through, what were the hard parts or the sticky points in figuring out what was important to you versus what was important to the values you grew up with or the different communities you were part of? Was that hard to unravel?
Oh, I think it was very hard to unravel growing up with being identified as a child who was going to become a doctor, right? So I think in your culture, as you were talking about before, and certainly in my culture, that was a great honor. I was not only honoring my father, but I was going into a profession that was universally honored and believed in. And so there's this whole sense of identity that was put on me by society and family, et cetera, that I embraced and clung to. But when I started changing internally, it wasn't always easy to start slipping that identity off because I wasn't the only one who was identifying myself that way. My community, my family, my spouse, everyone also identified me that way too. So I think that was a really difficult part, was not just the internal change, but then making the internal change external and having to deal with some of the blowback and pushback. I mean, it's hard for people to see you, someone they love, changing into something they weren't expecting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's wrapped up with their identity as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then, so you've been through that various times. You know, there was like the being a kid to being the doctor en route. And then there was like being the doctor towards this moment of like realizing that you didn't have to be a doctor and you had the financial and emotional permission to do something else. And then you're involved in the finance community in a certain way. And now you're, I don't know if it's like heretical what you're saying, but you're more integrated, right? It's like this kind of integrated worldview. That's another transition. Do you have any insight as to where that's going to lead you? Or do you see like the limit of that identity already on the horizon and what you might run into or do next?
So, I think the struggle at this point in my life, and I think a lot of us get there as we start meeting our financial goals, is, I grew up an achievement junkie. I was used to achieving things, and that was exciting to me, right? And you would see the peak and you'd be climbing towards a peak and you'd get there and you'd bask in it. But of course, then you saw further down the horizon and there was another peak just farther the way up. So I've lived my whole life as an achievement junkie, and that brought a small certain percentage of joy. But now I'm also at the place in life where I realize that achievements can be a treadmill that's not so fun either. Like you're running on that treadmill and you're running faster and faster, trying to get farther and farther. And you find that you're really not going anywhere. So when I started to really think after dealing with the dying, after thinking about money, putting it together for me and what feels coherent is, I think what truly brings me contented and happiness is making meaningful progress towards something I care about. And so in the book, I call this the climb. But part of making meaningful progress in something I care about is you have to enjoy the progress too. So I like to talk about my podcast in these terms. I would love it if my podcast got 1 million downloads every month. I think that would be amazing, stupendous. I think that would be wonderful goal and achievement. On the other hand, I don't know if I would really enjoy living my life as that being my overarching goal, that either I succeeded or I failed. And if I failed, I wouldn't feel good about life. So instead, I start looking about what I can control. Some of my best moments of the day are when I hit record and I start running an interview for my podcast. So as opposed to worrying about the product, getting 1 million downloads a month, I really love the process. And so in life right now, part of the climb for me is finding things in which I really love the process of doing, but because I am achievement junkie, I like this idea that I can feel like I'm making progress. So I might never make it to 1 million downloads, but maybe this year I can get 1,000 more downloads a month than I got last year. So that to me is that kind of happy place where you love what you're doing. You love the process, regardless of the product or what you produce. And yet you still feel you can put in some goals that feel comfortable, where you feel like you're always getting a little farther. I make a joke. I always say to my kids, may you never reach your dreams, but may you get 90% of the way there. And it kind of gets to this idea that being engaged in the climb is very pleasing. And feeling like you're making it towards the top is very pleasing, but sometimes getting to the top is not so pleasing. And that's okay. And that's something that it's taken me years to come to terms with. But I find that it's much more comfortable. So when I look at what is the next transition, it's interesting because for the first time in my life, I really just feel very purposeful in most of what I do every day. And that's a real new thing for me over the last few years. And I've also feel like I've pretty much accomplished most of the things I need to accomplish in life, like the really important things. So now I'm concentrating on really enjoying what I'm doing and setting up these kind of mini small goals that still feel good moving towards without getting too anxious about whether I get there or not. And so I don't know, will that be the rest of my life? Or will I all of a sudden get really goal focused on something else? I mean, writing this book and deciding to market it as opposed to just putting it out there and doing nothing means that obviously I'm building towards a goal. But I'm trying to be conscious about making that feel really good. Like when it stops feeling good, then I need to reorient and do something different.
Yeah. And there's a great harmony there that it seems to me it's more likely that you'll achieve the goals if you enjoy the process, because you'll be able to be consistent and not just be like, fuck it, and give up after a certain amount of days. Yeah.
And not only that, but on some point, if I'm really enjoying myself and I don't achieve the goal, then I've achieved a different goal. And in itself, that is becoming enough. And it gets back a little bit to my personal philosophy. And my mom taught me this. I'm very thankful. I used to stress about things a lot, right? As in medical school, I stressed about my tests and about my boards and all that. And my mom used to say, you know what, you're enough already. And I think that I'm trying to look at life that way now, as opposed to saying I'll be enough when I accomplish this or I get there or I do this big thing that I'm anxious about. I really try to say, you know what, you're enough already, and whatever happens today or tomorrow is not going to change that. And that really provides a much more contented look at those things that befall us that sometimes we don't have a control. Like I can market the heck out of this book and hopefully people will love it and buy it, but maybe they won't.
Yeah. Do you share that with your kids, that you're enough already?
I try to as much as I can. And I try, especially because I remember being that stressed out kid, like when the SATs came up or a test came up. And I was like, it's like do or die. And if I don't do well today, everything's going to go to crap. Right. And now it's much different. Now, sometimes I tell them this is the day to celebrate who you are and all you've accomplished. Like nothing that happens tomorrow, whether you ace the test or whether you fail it, can change all you are and all you've become. And I really try to hold on to that and teach them to hold on to that. Because I feel like it gives you a much different look at the world and yourself and where you fit.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I have this sense that when you can hold a belief like that and remember it, it's really what comes through beneath all the words and all the teaching. So whether you're like, you have this podcast about finance and investing, if that's really what you're holding, hopefully that's what everyone who hears your show hears, is that you're enough already. And then all the other kind of like the rational layers peppered on top of that.
Yeah, I've definitely found that from a personal standpoint, it makes me feel much more calm and content in life. That I think that the two secrets I've come to, three secrets I've come to, especially from writing this book, is one is you're already enough. Two is find those climbs in life that are worth doing and enjoy them. And the last is, in general, I find the most happy people I know are the ones who look back and tell themselves the stories about their lives that make them the hero. Like I know a lot of miserable people, and when you ask them about their past, they'll tell you all the bad things that happened to them. And then I know a lot of really happy people, who you ask about the past and they'll tell you all the bad things that'll happen to them, and they'll tell you why it was magical. And so I think that those are the three pieces of wisdom that I really hold on to as of recent.
Yeah, it's so powerful. The facts happen, but we're in total control of the interpretation. And we can make them make sense or make them into a tragedy at our leisure. But you use the word hero, and that's, this podcast is called 10,000 Heroes. And the whole point is to communicate the idea that we all have the seeds of being our own hero. And being a hero is doing exactly what you did, of matching what works for you, like understanding your purpose, your strengths, what flows for you, what you love, and doing that to contribute to the world. So thank you. And I'm curious, who inspires you? Like who would you say a couple of your heroes are, and why?
All right. So first and foremost, the person that I would answer most often to this question, and it's because I'm really digging podcasting and interviewing people, is I am enamored with Terry Gross of NPR. So Fresh Air. She has just done some of the most fantastic interviews over decades. And like her, I want to be doing this 30 years later and still sounding like this is the coolest thing ever. She asks really good questions. She just interviews people really well. And I think it's fantastic. It's funny. I admire a lot of my friends, especially in the personal finance world. I see people who just do things that amaze me. Grant Sabatier, the guy who wrote Financial Freedom, really, he's a friend of mine. He pushed me to write this book. And for instance, I look at him every day and I'm like, man, the things he accomplishes and what he's done in the world. I interview all these people on my podcast. Tanya Hester wrote the book Wallet Activism. She's a personal finance person, but she's also worried about the world and the environment and activism. And I read her book and I'm like, I wish I could write like that. And so, it's these, of course we look at these famous people, but there's just a lot of people I know and I see parts of them. I'm like, wow, that's cool. The great thing, I guess, about being this part of life, especially when it comes to your friends, is as opposed to saying, I wish I could do that, I now can say, wow, I feel such a sense of accomplishment that you did that. And I care for you. And this is so cool to see you succeeding. And that's also been a nice change too. Like, there's something amazing if you can start celebrating other people's wins, because then you don't even have to do it yourself, right? You can just celebrate them and their wins. And strangely enough, I started feeling good about myself for that, which is weird, right?
Yeah, no, that's been a big part of my journey too. I think when I was younger, I saw that as competitive or maybe like diminishing my own possibility. But now I really feel tuned into this broader mission of like contributing to the evolution of our society, which is just a huge goal that I can't have much of an impact on. So everyone else who's also doing that, I'm super stoked about, I'm like, oh yes, thank you. We need you.
My kids did that too. Like having kids, there's nothing like having a spouse and kids who you really care about to like take it outside yourself and then be like, wow, you accomplished that. That was so cool. I'm so proud. Like, I'm proud to be your parent because you accomplished that thing. And that kind of, again, it takes it out of that personal realm, but then you can celebrate so much more, right? Because there's only so much you or I can do. And when you look at the fact that we are these tiny specks of dust in millions and millions of years of existence, probably no one's going to remember you or I in 100 years. But our group accomplishments, our joys, our fears, our loves, all that kind of, I think, continues to exist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I had this vision of the people that helped develop or invent the stone knife or whatever it was. Who knows who they are, but they've really contributed to like this larger project.
Yeah. And it's had far downstream effects that they couldn't have imagined.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So maybe taking it back a little bit, not to your book exactly, but to the reason why you wrote it. If it is successful, it is like marketed correctly, people read it, what would be the positive effect? Like, how would we know? What would be the indicator that we'd see in our society in 5 or 10 years? Like, what's the outcome that you're hoping beyond just your narrow contribution in your book?
I think the real outcome would be to change the narrative to being much more intentionally intentional about money such that you really started thinking about what you wanted out of your money before you started thinking about your money. So I see a world in which we really start thinking much more intentionally about who we want to be and what we want to accomplish in this world, and use that as the jumping off or starting point to then building a financial framework that can support it. And so I see much more intentionality, much less chasing dollar signs, and much more chasing experiences and purpose and identity and connecting to other people, but not ignoring the fact that money can be a powerful tool. So being smart about how you go about collecting that money and using it to your benefit.
Yeah. Beautiful. I want to live in that world too.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like a good world, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So Jordan, you've done, I mean, this is my 30th or 40th podcast interview. You've done 300. Is there any questions you think I should be asking, or any other areas you want to get into? I'm happy to cede the floor here and help you if you want to direct the ship.
Yeah, no, about me, definitely not. I mean, what I guess I get asked often, which I think is relevant, is people say, knowing what you now, would you have done things differently? Like I get asked that a lot, and I always get stuck on it because part of me wants to say, yes, I've learned all these things. I've written this book. I would be a lot more intentional and use purpose and meaning and be more thoughtful about it. But then also part of me says that you get where you are for a reason. It's that, again, telling yourself those stories about life that make you a hero. And part of my past is I choose to look at it as the path I needed to take to be where I am today. So that's an incomplete answer. I think I might have been more intentional about doing hospice work way earlier in my career if I was to do it again. But I think I'd still become a doctor, even if communicating is my true purpose and identity. I think I had to get here through the circuitous path. And so, again, I don't think we should beat ourselves up for doing it right or doing it wrong. We are where we are on purpose. And that's what gives us all that wonderful insight we hopefully have now about how to live our lives.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think that's a beautiful way to end the interview. It's a message of like hope and also reinforcement and trust of the path and the journey that we're all on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a fabulous conversation.
That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. Thanks again for listening, and I hope that this has contributed in some small way to your own personal journey of heroism. I'd like to give a shout out to Pierre for the episode artwork, DJ Plainview for the theme music, and to our producer-editor, Martine. This podcast is sponsored by Momentum Lab, our year-long coaching program providing insight, accountability, a community of excellence, and one-on-one support. I encourage anyone who's intrigued to go to whatismomentumlab.com and explore. Finally, I love communication. If this episode has impacted your life in any way, let me know. Our email is info@10kh.show, and there's other ways to contact us in the show notes. Thank you, have a wonderful day, and take care.